Greetings, one and all. Mr. Patriarch, joined by Northern Man tonight or this afternoon, depending on your global location. How are you doing, my friend?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. Yeah, just chugging along.
Excellent. Very good. Happy to hear it. So, a little update about the channel. This is the first stream I've done in a while. I've had some pretty spotty internet connection of late. So, there's actually no internet at my house. So, I've been using my phone to kind of get things up and running. But my problem is although the cell signal in the general area is good, I live at the bottom of a hill, fairly close to the cell tower. So I think a lot of the dirt and whatever sort of absorbs the the cell signal that would otherwise be hitting our place. So, but it seems to be going good. If there's any issues in the comments, just type something. But I think we're pretty good for now. So, as far as things that we have coming, I'll just get the shills out of the way. This is Mr. Patriarch, the channel. If you're new here, please give this video a like and subscribe. If you enjoy what you see, you can also support the channel. Links can be found below through PayPal, Subscribe Star. Next week, I have the privilege of having on Jimmy Thomist, a Canadian gentleman who has been through staff college. We're going to talk about the realities of modern warfare, how it differs from previous iterations of warfare, and then discuss, after sort of laying that groundwork, the sort of the goings on in the war in Ukraine with Russia, what challenges both sides face, and specifically kind of the maybe some of the more bureaucratic hurdles that Russia also has to go through with their military. So that's kind of what I have going. I'll, of course, be loading up another episode of my wildly popular, quote unquote, Reflections of a Russian Statesman. I like to think of the Reflections of a Russian Statesman chapters as kind of like academic agents, Andy Warhol streams. They're there for the real fans, I guess. But yeah, it's just kind of a passion project of mine. Anyways, that's it. Northern Man, do you have anything you'd like to shill before you begin?
No, I can't guarantee that I'll put anything out in the near future. I'm hoping to get another video out that'll kind of link into this about English identity and positivism, because I think that modern English identity, we're going to go in this in the video, but I think that the identity of Englishmen these days is very much what we're against and not what we actually are, which I don't like that way of thinking. But I'm hoping to put that out soon. But I will say that I'm busy with some of my personal life things. I've got a baby on the way in a month. So yeah, if I get it out, I'm really hoping I will. If I get it out, yeah, it'll be on my channel.
Excellent. And that sort of ties in nicely to one of the topics that we'll be talking about of manhood and prioritizing the important things in life. Now, let's get started off right away. So the kind of the topic for the stream, Northern Man and I have been sort of exchanging messages kind of back and forth, thinking about sort of what we wanted to do. And fortunately for us, kind of, academic agent has been sort of on the war path against sort of America on Twitter. Good friend of the channel. We love AA. And I'm kind of saying that sort of tongue in cheek. He definitely doesn't hate Americans. He's a big fan of American pop culture, loves his McDonald's, loves his Seinfeld, etc. But this kind of got me thinking about the topic for this stream, which, like I said, Northern Man and I had been discussing, and ideas about identity, and then extrapolating from that, going broader, what it means to try and, I guess, have a meaningful identity rooted in people, place, faith, tradition in this modern time. And then specifically, because Northern Man and I are both we're of a similar age and kind of a similar phase in our lives, sort of where, we're starting families, we're, trying to be providers and so on and so forth. And be the spiritual leaders of our household, and sort of how does that sort of fit into all this? So I guess we'll start off at the very most basic element first, which is kind of where we came from, and then go into a broad and sort of our understandings growing up about what sort of it meant to be an American or an Alaskan, and what it means to be, an Englander or somebody from North England, and then sort of how that changed through time. So, Northern, take it away. Tell me, what is an Englishman?
It's a good question because I think that you could easily get bogged down in what Morgoth and AA would call like Spitfire and kind of biscuit tin England, where we won World War II and we're all about drinking tea and wearing top hats and having a fancy accent. And obviously, I'm not necessarily from that lineage, but it certainly plays into modern England. And um, I specifically chose Englishman here because I think that the term British is we're so flat and linear, and it's such an imperial identity at this point that people, I know that Americans especially tend to associate that term Britain as like England get large. But let's face it, I feel like modern Britain today represents very little of what Englishmen used to represent in the past. And also, I mean, just a poignant point that I remember in like maybe a couple of months ago. I remember when when I, I was discussing the England football team with my family, and one time my grandma said, like, I mean, how many of these players are actually British? And like, I remember my wife retorted like, "Oh, these people, they're British. They live in the British Isles." And she was like, "Yeah, but are they actually English? Like, I mean, the term English, an ethnic identity." And that's where I feel like a lot of my thoughts on this began, because it really is true that the England and English as an identity is very much separate from Britain and the United Kingdom. It's not as it used to be in the past, where the UK is just England get large. In fact, I think the British identity has become so amorphous and so all encompassing. It's become a very civic nationalist term. It's a term for a passport that you get. It's a term for living in a set nation. I don't think it's an ethnic term anymore. Certainly not. And I even said this in a tweet a few days ago. Like, I'm a Briton, Briton, but I'm not. You wouldn't say I wouldn't say I'm British as in an ethnicity, because it definitely doesn't have ethnic links anymore. Um, to put it very simply, I think England and English as an identity is very much. I tend to follow in with Morgoth on that line of thought, that England is an island people. We enjoy our own place. We enjoy a certain expected set of manners. We enjoy our countryside. And while we treat people from overseas politely, we always like to keep them at arm's distance. It's like they're nice, but they're over there. And I think that that's an English identity very much. And we have our own way of doing things. And I've moved abroad. I've lived in China, and I've visited several places in Asia, and I noticed that island people, especially with links to like Japan as well. When I went to Japan, you could see very much similarities between like what I would think of the English identity and what the Japanese think of their identity. I think the only main difference is that Japan has not had to deal with an ethnic flood of watering down the identity to fit people in to be inclusive. Um, yeah, let's start. I'd say that like English people, they're an ethnic people. We're Anglo-Saxons still. We can trace our lineage back, and we have our own ways and customs. It's very much a deep-rooted culture and identity of family, of what we know, and the country that we're proud of. And the things we consume, I think they're a bit superfluous. But maybe we can get onto that later. I'll leave it there and I'll pass over to you.
Very good. Now, thanks for that. Yeah, I guess sort of for my part, I'll speak kind of about the American angle now. So, growing up in where I did in kind of rural, far northwest, red America, um, identity, culture, sort of what it meant to be an American was kind of, it was sort of, I feel in a certain way, it actually might have been more strong and pronounced than in the UK, to be honest. There's this, in the 90s at least, in the early 2000s, there was this idea of, we're connected to the founding fathers, and we're an English speaking country, and we like liberty, rah rah rah, stuff like that. But the actual nuts and bolts about kind of what made us different from other people's wasn't really a thing. And I really kind of became aware of how American I am and what that actually means when I lived around non-Americans. Specifically, when I lived in South Africa for 5 years. At that point, it became very clear to me what I was and what I wasn't in terms of my cultural preferences and patrimony.
Yeah, I
And
don't want to interrupt you,
go
but
ahead.
like I would agree with that. Like when I lived in China, I became more of like it became so evident what English was in comparison.
Yeah.
When you're the only element of it.
hmm No, that's certainly true. And I think that's one of the merits, honestly, of sort of traveling and living abroad. There's, of course, the sort of wine aunt, woo girl, like world traveler side of things, which you can do, which I don't recommend. But then there is something to be said about sort of becoming world wise through travel and sort of living abroad. And one of the benefits of that is that you understand sort of what cultures are. You're able to sort of appreciate different aspects of different cultures and understand modes of living, and sort of know that, your way of sort of doing things is by no means the universal. But also on the back end of that, what also happens is you become much more aware of kind of what your identity is in a sort of a lived way, instead of some sort of nebulous theoretical, uh, pontificating, as opposed, yeah. So through experience and sort of living your life, and then seeing how it juxtaposes with other people's lives, their cultures, their values, you become really aware of kind of what you are as an American, or as an Englishman, for instance. And the group that I, no surprise, gelled with by far the most when I was in South Africa were kind of the 1820s settler stock of South Africa, who were transported from the United Kingdom again in 1820, 200 years ago at this point. And they settled the frontier of the Western Cape and parts of what is now KwaZulu Natal. And they had an experience, so again, sort of their own kind of frontier experience, which sort of amplified and tempered some of the Anglo values similar to Americans, I would say. So, in my experience, they were very much the closest thing I'd sort of found to, like, other Americans, but just with kind of different accents, and, had to adjust to the particularities of the environment which they found themselves in, namely Africa, and dealing with Khoisans and Zulus and so forth. But then you start to think about, okay, so what are the commonalities that actually kind of join us together? What makes me more similar to you as an Anglo South African compared to somebody else? And Sargon of Akkad actually talked about this at some length on a number of occasions, or Carl Benjamin at this point now, I guess, where he said that what passes for liberalism as an ideology before that really was just sort of the culture, customs, traditions, and rights of free Englishmen, basically. And then it was sort of rationalized and then sort of shoehorned into this ideological framework. But yeah, Boer shout out from Feanor. Yes, hello Boers. They're kind of like Americans too, but again, higher in-group preference, and I think a lot of that actually has to do with their experience during the Anglo-Boer War. Being conquered by an outside power and whatnot. But we'll leave the Boers to the side for now. But yes, love to my Boer friends out there. But in any case, yes. So the ways in which an American has sort of an authentic sort of heritage identity is very much tied to this sort of Anglo tradition. Again, like I said, of this this independent streak, this jealous love of their sort of freedom and inherited rights. Ideas about fairness. The tradition of sort of being armed, free men sort of being able to be armed, the yeoman farmer. And these sorts of things, again, get sort of tempered and in some ways accentuated in the United States, or what becomes the United States, through living on the frontier and having to deal with, hostile natives. Similar sort of thing in South Africa as well. So, appreciation for guns among, sort of 1820 settlers in South Africa and Americans is very similar in a way which is not necessarily maintained in the other parts of the Anglosphere. And also kind of an inherent sort of distrust of government, sort of having to build things yourself, literally because you're kind of in the middle of nowhere. But it all sort of harkens back to this older, sort of more authentic English identity. And then what you kind of get, again, with the process of the living on the frontier, the inherent conflicts and difficulties that go with that, coupled with some ethnic admixture of, let's say Germans or Pennsylvania Dutch or whatever, kind of lends itself to the creation of a sort of an ethnogenesis, which is different from the mother country, in this case, England, but still very much tied to that older way of sort of traditional English being.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you a question about this because I think what really severs American identity from English identity in this fact is that, especially when I speak to Americans and their lineage, is that Victorian period between, like, let's say, like 1805, when um, the relationship between the US and the UK is definitely severed. Obviously the independence in 1803, but yeah. And then like the entire building of empire, and the Victorian peculiarities that come with that, like Victorian novels and the steam engine and like the industrial environment of Victorian England is very peculiar, and it wears on the character, I can say, for definite, because as a Northern Englishman, my I grew up in a steel town. It was a town that was built purely for this one steelworks, and the we I grew up in terraced housing, like linked housing estates that you would expect in an industrial area, and that's my peculiar air of being. And this is what I find interesting with people say that England is a long-lasting character, but I think a lot of what English identity is today, when we try and get outside of biscuit tin Britishisms of defeating mid-century Germany, is just Victorian industrialism and imperialism, and especially with Northernism, it's like the miners and the industrial workers and low-level living. Most of my family grew up in poverty levels, and even my parents grew up. Well, my parent, because I grew up in a single-parent household. My parent grew up in a low-income household. Like it's interesting because when I feel like what really divides English and American identity is that time in between, and it sounds obvious when you think about it, but so much of English identity now rose up through that period, and it's the same with American identity. A lot of American authors and American philosophers and people that did a thinking in the American period, like distanced and created a uniqueness for your identity that the English cannot relate to. And similarly with the Victorian era in England.
I think that's a really good point. Yes. So on one level, I think America, although it certainly had what would be thought of, as a working class during the Industrial Revolution, it had much. I feel like the phenomenon of, let's just say, the working class or whatever as a group was much less pronounced in the United States than it was in the United Kingdom, for example. You had much more, in a certain way, kind of that older mode of being with sort of the yeoman farmer out in the middle of nowhere, with his 10 acres and a mule, so to speak. And so this type of being, while it certainly existed in the cities on the East Coast in certain places, was complicated by the fact that a lot of those people who did end up taking those jobs were immigrant workers, Irish or Italians, Germans, Dutch, whatever. And then a lot of the people who settled the rest of the country, which is most of it in terms of landmass, were of this kind of older, pre-industrial sort of type.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that America retained a bit of pre-industrial classism that doesn't exist today in
Yeah,
England.
yeah. No, I think that is sort of a difference. So, like someone in the United States saying, I'm working class or whatever, would just sound kind of weird. Um, just because, again,
Yeah,
like I said, it wasn't the same thing. Yeah, I mean, yes, we had the same phenomenons of industrialization and whatnot, but it was a very different. It was very different in terms of how it affected the character of the nation as a whole. And sort of added on top of this, um, what you're talking about with the that was actually a really good point. How sort of the benefits of sort of the expanse of the United States and sort of all the land and whatnot, and Americans sort of being able to sort of retain the sort of pre Victorian mode of being by and large for a long time, is I see a parallel sort of between like the Dutch and the Afrikaners, for example. And I mentioned we wouldn't go off on an Afrikaner tangent, but I think it is kind of illustrative. So you had sort of like this core identity of the Dutch who settled down there at first, but then you had, if you look at Afrikaner ancestry today, it's very much kind of a hodgepodge. They're not just like straight up Dutch. Like most of them have a very mixed ancestry of Dutch, of German, of French Huguenot. And then while while the Netherlands was going through, their process of, being, merchants and sort of industrializing and so on and so forth, while of course retaining, a large agricultural sector. These people sort of in isolation kind of retained in some senses an older idea of what it meant to be, basically a Dutch Calvinist through sort of, again, living on the frontier. And, South Africa at the time only had a population of about 4 million in an area that's, massive. I think it's certainly bigger than Texas. And I think it's like 2 times larger than Germany. So it's a very large area with a very small population at the time. And then again, sort of the conflict and the being sort of in some senses free from the the new trends going on in the continent and whatnot, uh, did create kind of a different character compared to the Dutch that sort of begat them originally. And one of the other things too that I think is very important for solidifying identity is actually conflict. And in the cases of both sort of America and South Africa, that sort of came in two different senses. So in the first sense, it was the conflict with the land itself and sort of the natives that inhabited it. So American Indians trying to tame the wilderness, with the Afrikaners trying to deal with the different Bantus and dealing with a land that was pretty not very good actually in terms of producing very high yield agriculture. And then secondly is sort of the outside kind of existential threats. So, America, of course, had its revolt, I think I'd call it, against the British Crown. And that conflict did sort of, at the end of it anyway, did solidify in the minds of Americans that they're kind of a different people, of course, very similar, but different from us. And then with the Afrikaners, of course, they had the Anglo-Boer Wars, who, of course, with the different language, different religion, and Britain's imperial ambitions, was much less. They had much less affinity and fraternity to begin with, but the conflict did sort of set up the Afrikaners in their own minds, partially as being like, yeah, we're this distinct people who lives down on the southern tip of Africa. We've sort of maintained these older traditional ways of being. And as a result, now that we've had to, deal with fighting off the British for one time and then losing again, that identity is sort of reinforced through our experience that we are not them, basically.
I mean, the interesting fact with the Boers as well is that they really rejected this Anglo idea of cohesion with the black classes. Like they didn't really they viewed themselves as a separate identity, and I wouldn't necessarily say that the Boers built them up against the black South Africans, but they definitely didn't want to build this multi-culti
No,
kind of
certainly
modern
not.
globo homo identity. They wanted a distinct identity, and I used to have some friends who were South African, and they were quite liberal South African. And when they told me like how the Boers live and what the Boers believe, I was just like, so based. Somehow, I wish my own countrymen would
Yeah.
would adopt some of those ideas.
Yes, that's certainly true. And I think, again, a lot of that had to deal with the fact of the experience of the Anglo-Boer War, like I said. So, long story short, the second Anglo-Boer War was pretty nasty for the Afrikaners, and events like that kind of become seminal moments, I think, in a people's history. In the same way that the Holocaust is very much tied up with Jewish identity today, or in Russia.
Woo, lad, hey up.
Yeah. Or well, it's. I think this is a very common historical phenomenon, and in the same way with Russia, like today, one of the things that sort of pulls them together and gives them a sense of national, pride and whatever is sort of winning the Great Patriotic War, as they call it, World War II, or Palestinians sort of identify themselves largely sort of being sort of in opposition to the Israelis, or the Pakistanis or the Bangladeshis, through their conflicts with the Hindu Indians and so forth. So I think this is a thing that you see sort of throughout history, this where conflict with sort of what is perceived as an outgroup really hones in and really hones in what a culture thinks of as itself and creates kind of a national consciousness, which otherwise might not have been there before. And even with the UK, similar sort of thing, like you said earlier on in the stream, the Bulldog nationalism, the Spitfires, the Biscuit Tins, all that's tied up with World War II. And I think in very much large part, England itself has had a similar sort of experience through the Second World War, where it has sort of identified itself, in both good ways and bad ways, as sort of being on the other side of that conflict.
Absolutely. And I think that like the problem is it plays very much into what AA would call the boomer truth regime, where like the ultimate bad in the world is the big F word in the middle of the 20th century. And like this is what I was talking about trying to refine English identity back to something that's more in its roots. Because as much as I agree that conflict, like molds an identity, it helps you see what you're not. Too often, just being based on what you're not will lead you into a bigger evil that you are. And even with
Right.
the Second World War, like, oh, we're not those guys. We're definitely not Mustache Man and Big Chin Man, and we're not those guys. And we just ended up like twisting off into some horrible amalgamated like mutant of liberalism where you can't possibly put restrictions on people's life because that would infringe on their freedoms, like as if Englishmen in the past, in the Victorian era, they had such strong social expectations of people. They had strong, not enforced laws, but like socially enforced laws.
Yeah, there was a
People were
very
expected.
that was
Yeah, go
that
ahead.
is something which is, I think, very much largely evaporated in the West, is the degree to which that sort of social fabric was less like a fabric and more like chainmail was just sort of
Yeah.
reinforced layers of obligation, of duty, of expectation, and using shame as a reinforcement mechanism. These were all very prominent aspects of what it meant to be, a person in the West. And in the different cultures, of course, this manifested in different ways, but nevertheless, these are things which I do think we have very much kind of lost today, which were present in the past. And that'll sort of lead us on to sort of where we're going to take this stream, I guess, for the duration. But yeah, I guess that's what I have to say for now.
Yeah, and one of those bastions of social pressure in England that like it's a bit different in the US, but slightly like it's on the same kind of line is, excuse me, is the church. And the Anglican Church, I mean, as much as you can laugh about, it's such a laughable institution these days. It's the absolute epitome of a cut church. It stands for nothing that it's tradition. As much as you can say that it has traditions, it stands for none of them. But in the Victorian past, high Anglicanism really it really drew back to its roots of Catholicism, the roots of the Anglican Church of Cranmer, but also saints before as well. During the Victorian era, you saw the rebirth of and the restoration of so many of the saints. Their icons where they're buried was rebuilt, and that has been just totally dismantled. Like when I first started becoming a Christian, like I really tried to, because I was such a keen on holding on to my English identity. I went down the Anglican route, and it's so embarrassing these days that the Anglican Church is such a hollowed out corpse of its former self. Um, Even it can't even uphold basic principles in a book that it holds so dear to its own reality. It's very pathetic.
Sad. Yeah. No. That is that is unfortunately the case of many denominations these days. I think kind of the holdouts against that are sections of what you and I might call apostolic Christianity, so Orthodoxy or Catholicism, and
Mhm.
also certain sects of American Protestantism that are not mainline. So specifically like evangelicals and whatnot. Now their theology might be a little suspect, let us say, but in terms of their sort of cultural attitudes, generally speaking, they are much more kind of conservative than what you will typically find in Europe or sort of these mainline denominations or secular Americans. And I think a lot of that has to do again with kind of it taps into that sort of older spirit of America in a certain sense. And this is, I guess, sort of wrapping up kind of on the cultural identity point. I guess both the good and bad. A lot of people will say, you know, America is this propositional nation with its Declaration of Independence and its Constitution and whatever. And I think there is an extent to which, you know, the words of the Declaration could certainly be interpreted that way. And Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration, was, you know, himself kind of an Enlightenment deist and a non-insignificant minority of the founding fathers were kind of a similar sort of mold. But if you actually look at what America is, like the people, and in a certain way that, in a similar way that you wouldn't look at the French revolutionaries and say, oh yeah, they speak for the French people. Actual Americans are not that. I guess in my defense of Americans.
To defend the founding fathers a bit more as well. I mean, I did, but part of my degree was and I found American revolutionary culture very much as revolutionary, as much as you can find it revolutionary. I found it very enriching, but I don't think, as much as you can criticize the fathers today, I don't think they ever foresaw of America being like this multi-ethnic. They very much wrote that document in a sense for Anglo settlers, that it built on principles of English law that had been set down beforehand, and same with the English. They didn't specifically have to write in the Magna Carta, oh, by the way, F the French. That was just implicit in the document. Like, there's no French in this document, so they're not included. And like, I'm sure that if you, as much as we'd all like to dig them up and ask them these questions, I'm fairly certain they could have never foreseen this happening.
No, I would agree with that. I think there are certain elements to the peculiarities of certain types of American religion. So, like Puritanism, for example. So that when you do sort of eventually have it uprooted from faith in God and sort of traditional morality, it can kind of mutate into this, you know, progressive ideology that we sort of see today. But I don't necessarily think that was an inevitability. And most of America wasn't even Puritan after a certain point. You know, I mean, even in the early days, in the founding fathers, you know, Virginia was a very different place from Massachusetts, right? The backwoods, the hollers of Kentucky were not, you know, Puritanville. It wasn't Boston. So yeah, that's what I would say on that. And also, crap, I just had a thought. It was important, and I can't remember it. Dang it. Shoot.
But even to take a point from that,
maybe I'll remember.
Like the American. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I was just saying, connected to sort of what you were going on before about the document. It says in the Constitution, in the preamble, you know, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, right? Now, that last bit right there, that means secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our children. That's what posterity means. So right there in the Constitution, it's sort of presupposes the existence of Americans and their descendants, right? And that by necessity excludes most people. So,
And even tangentially, the American nation as it grew up on the North American continent grew up alongside a British colony in the north of Canada and a Spanish colony in the south, and they felt no need to include these people or exclude them in the document. They knew it was. I don't want to speak on their behalf, but I believe that they knew it was specifically for the people, the Anglo-Saxon people, and people that had come there for their interest, and people with a historical, ethnic, and social lineage. They didn't feel the need to include the Spanish and the French or the Canadians in the north. In fact, they were implicitly against them.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yeah, when they wrote the Constitution, they did not mean Mexicans, they did not mean Spaniards, they did not mean Quebecois, they did not mean Canadians. So that's or
they
American Indians for that example. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that is a very good point. So yeah, this idea that ever since the beginning, you know, America was this sort of hodgepodge of, you know, just different people. America is an idea. America is for everybody. That was not true. It eventually became that, you know, with the idea of the sort of American melting pot. But that was actually, you know, a pretty new thing. Like people had a sense of themselves as Americans. Yeah. And maybe having ties to sort of the old country, to the Anglo-Saxon stock and whatnot. And then, like I said, over time, you know, you have this German admixture particularly, and then other people like the Dutch come in. And yeah, those are different and whatnot, but they really did sort of assimilate into this kind of heritage American Anglo-Saxon identity, largely because... Go ahead.
Sorry, like here's a problem I have as well. As much as you can criticize the American nation as a propositional nation, the English nation, and by lineage also the German, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, all of them, all of those are non-propositional nations in that they have an ethnic lineage, and this didn't stop them being corrupted into a liberal like GAE empire, feudal, like vassal state. This didn't stop them happening. So it doesn't necessarily, just because you don't have an ethnic idea of the people doesn't necessarily make you bulletproof to this kind of liberalization and multiculturalism.
Yeah,
because they just lengthen the goalpost. Like even now today, despite the fact that everyone knows that England means specifically the Anglo-Saxons, we have freaking Dave. What the bloody hell is his name? AA absolutely hates him. David Lamb, I think his name is.
David Lammy.
Lammy, that's it. Lammy in the Parliament claiming that he's an Englishman. Like, I know he's an Englishman, and he knows that he's not an Englishman, but he will push and kick and tantrum until those goalposts are moved to include him.
Yeah, no, that's certainly the case. And again, sort of like what I said kind of earlier on, but I'll sort of reiterate again because I think it's important in kind of understanding the American identity. It is kind of a new, you know, historically speaking, a new culture. You could say America is kind of an example of what's called ethnogenesis, right? Where a new people group sort of arises. And you see this from time to time. So there's always the assumption that, you know, particularly in kind of right-wing circles, that if you're not already part of a distinct ethnic group, then you're just a sort of deracinated, you know, individual with no sort of culture or identity or whatever. But occasionally you do have sort of new ethnic identities come up over time. And An example of this, like I say, are the Afrikaners, the Americans, and also the coloreds, who are sort of another group, or even like mestizo culture in Spain. Like that didn't exist until the Spaniards arrived and intermingled with the natives, right? So, and with America, I think it definitely has and retains that older Anglo-Saxon core, but again, through the influences, again, interbreeding with Germans and Dutch and so forth, plus the frontier, the dominant mode of being is still Anglo-Saxon, but it is different, although closer to that Anglo-Saxon tradition than anything else, if that sort of makes sense.
Hmm. I think it's tough because the problem is even when I was living abroad in China, like a lot of the people that I met that were American were just so deracinated and guilted,
Yeah.
like liberal white people who hated their own culture and their identity. I mean, they have so much to be proud of as well.
Yeah.
Like I studied American history all through my undergraduate degree, and I love American history despite not being a part of it. And that doesn't. It's such a sad, sorry state of affairs to see these people so self-loathing of their own culture, and like their only test to fame, their only like link to culture is like, oh, I'm part Cajun. Like, oh, good Lord, give me strength.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. And I think this sort of got complicated because America, in a certain sense, yes, it had. I think it would be fair to say that it had this sort of broad, vague kind of American identity. But really, what you had in America were regional identities, very strong ones, particularly a difference between Southerners and Yankees. And then also, over time, Appalachians, who are different from both. And then you had the people in the West, like west of the Mississippi, who developed, again, an identity that was also kind of different from the Southerners, the Appalachians, or the Yankees. So you have this interesting mix of different particularities in the regions. And
I
I
don't know
think,
why I don't even know why this is so tough for Europeans to understand either, because even in a small island like England, we it has such regional disparities. We have Brummies from Birmingham, Scousers from Liverpool, Manx from Manchester, like, and these are very small places in such a small country.
right.
Comparative to the US, it is not surprising that it grew up regional identities in such a vast space.
Hmm. Yeah. But I guess kind of the difficulty nowadays is that there is a certain mobility of Americans, which I think isn't really seen that much in other cultures. It may actually be unparalleled, sort of the extent to which the modern American, let's say, not necessarily in the past, but the modern American is kind of floats from state to state. So he'll grow up, in Massachusetts, but then he'll move to California. He'll go then get a corporate job. His branch will transfer him to Texas, and this is just normal. And this goes on for years,
It's
So
the same. It's the same in the UK. I can tell you like, and I get it. I like they're what I would call like the rootless metropolitan class of people, where
yeah,
they just wander around to wherever the money is. And I mean, people would probably laugh at me and said, "Well, you went to China, right? You moved where the money is." And true, true. And I I long for a time where I could have just stayed where my people grew up. But equally, it's the same class of people in London. They grew up in London and they moved to Manchester because there's more jobs there, there's more lucrative opportunities, and then they just wander around the UK cities looking for money, essentially.
yeah, yeah. Many such cases over here as well, certainly. Um, but I think what ended up happening is that a real kind of solidly unified ethnic American identity was kind of in the creation, but then it basically got short circuited by like the 1964 Immigration Act, and now it's that that sort of stability in which you sort of need to form kind of a national character. Like I would say, America's always kind of had a national character insofar as that it wasn't other places, but kind of a firm understanding of itself and what it meant to be an American was kind of coming about in the 1950s, but then basically, through like cultural Marxism and mass immigration, this basically got short circuited. So I think in the future we'll have, as either America balkanizes or Red Caesar comes in to save the day or whatever. I think an American identity will emerge in the future, but it will not be it will not be from
It
sea
won't
to
be
shining
based.
sea, so to
It won't
speak.
be. It won't be based on the only identifying factor of being able to spread sodomy around the globe. Like,
Yeah, yeah. No, it won't be that, and it won't be from sea to shining sea either. So I think it's safe to say that, like Southern California, for example, I mean, that's just going to become, basically a Latino ethno state at some point. Same with like
it
parts of
it
New
it
Mexico and places
it,
like
it
that.
it's such an odd place, like California, because I know from like meeting people and like media that's come out of it that like North California is as based and red state as it gets, and like they've got these two cities that just destroy all of their culture and identity.
Yeah. It's a very similar thing to kind of like how London is a leprous growth on the rest of the UK. um,
Absolutely.
yeah, LA, and San Francisco, unfortunately, just sort of called the shots for the rest of the state because that's all where the wealth, power, and influence is. In
Mhm.
addition to the population centers, so sad, but it is what it is. So I guess sort of moving on now. I just realized we've been going now for almost an hour. I was like, man, we haven't even sort of touched sort of other topics. But this is good. Nice conversation about identity. I think that was sort of important. Sort of laying the groundwork for kind of our thoughts and what these specific themes sort of mean to us. Now, I guess sort of going on a little bit into sort of the rest of this discussion, apart from identity, sort of as someone who is, I would, sort of say a middle-aged millennial, right? Which is kind of what you and me are. We're
Oh,
not like,
such a horrible term, isn't it? Like,
yeah,
I really don't look forward to when our generation are the boomers, because we're gonna be even more hated, I think.
yeah, yeah. But in this sort of day and age, again, like I said, sort of with this sort of nebulous notion of identity, and then kind of developing it over time, as we sort of talked about, what obstacles did you sort of have to overcome in order to, I guess, sort of become uh, the traditional man your heart yearned for but didn't know you wanted initially?
And yeah, it's a good question. I think because I know that you did, Mr. Patriarch, and me as well, and I feel like a lot of people who come to this conclusion go through their libertarian phase, which is like
Oh yeah,
it's so symptomatic of like base right wingers, is that for some reason we go through the libertarian pipeline. Um, but I feel like the ultimate problem came down to the fact that it was like, oh, if we could just all agree that we could all be free, we could just get along. And then people in opposition, I wouldn't just say the left, but even the center, or like, oh, we don't agree with your principles or your ideology, so we're just going to use the boot of power down on you. You just blackpill. You're just like, well, if they're going to use the boot of power against me, what is the only thing stopping me from doing the same thing to them? I mean, there's so many hurdles in modern life that turn you against the traditionalist mindset. I mean, first and foremost is the total like permeation of anti-traditional values. And I mean, especially I know that it is for you, Mr. Patriarch, and it is for me as well. One of the most like poignant points is trying to get people away from the big P demon, like sexually explicit content it is killing manhood in the West. Like it is just draining us of so much potential. The amount of my friends that I've met and I've said to them like why do you watch? It's a daily thing for them, and not even daily. Sometimes it can be like so habitual that it's multiple times a day that they indulge in this stuff. And it just drains them of all energy to like persevere, to try hard. It's so, and then you when you ask them like, why do you want to do this? They don't understand the negative consequences of it. They don't understand like it's so. I mean, as much as you don't realize it's impacting upon you, consuming that kind of material twists your perspective of pretty much everyone to the point where you view them all as just sexual objects for your own satisfaction.
Yeah. No, and I'll be honest here. You know, I am a recovered coomer. You know, and it is a very insidious thing, which I think very much attacks manhood today. And in a way, it both sort of hypersexualizes everything, where, like you say, you know, women sort of become objects. But on the other hand, in a weird way, it actually sort of takes the zest out of actual real life sex, and you almost get weary of of uh, of sexual excitement in a certain sense. So you're sort of habituated to this stuff. But on the flip side of it, you know, you'd think you'd just sort of be out there, you know, banging everything, but you really aren't. You're just you become sort of disenchanted and disconnected from, you know, like the healthy, sort of beautiful aspects of sex. You know, and not to get too graphic or anything, but you know, the intimacy of sort of being with a woman, you know, her body, you know, the skin, the touch, the feel, the excitement, sort of the natural arousal and all that sort of stuff. All that's sort of really stripped away with pornography,
Yeah,
and it's
it's just an end point. It's just like, especially for men, it's an end point. It's a satisfaction, and you're done, right?
yeah, yep, and you know, early on, and you know, I've been married for almost 6 years now, and early on in
Nice.
my marriage, I did. Oh my god, chat 69. Does someone have a band hammer? Put this user block user. Sex bot spamming the channel. Speaking of,
What an apt point for him to
yeah,
come up.
exactly.
Here comes the porn demon
Here comes
to
the porn
tempt you.
demon trying to corrupt the Zoomers in the chat. Yeah. But anyways, yeah. What was I saying? Oh yeah. So early on in sort of my marriage or whatever, this was still something that I was sort of struggling with, and I didn't realize. And you know, I thought everything was fine and whatever. But then after I sort of shook loose sort of the pornography, I realized, you know, like I did a quick double take, and I'm like, wow, like I wasn't having like actual sex nearly as much as I should have. And that might sound weird, but in sort of like the marriage context, like all your sexual energy was being diverted away from, you know, healthy outlets and sort of building intimacy with your wife. And, you know, as a married man, I'm sure you know this, like sex in a marriage is a wonderful thing, and it's great, and it produces children, and it's also, you know, it just brings you closer together. And especially if you're, you know, not getting on so well, and then afterwards it's just sort of like a nice reset button. You're like, I love you, yeah, everything's fine. And
For me as well, it's a totally guiltless outlet of that
oh
energy.
yeah,
There is no other outlet for that energy that doesn't end in misery. Like
mm,
that doesn't end at the end of the day going, what the heck was I so obsessed with that for?
yep, absolutely. And it's you know, your wife also really appreciates it. She likes being desired in that sort of healthy way. And it's great in terms of not just sort of how it makes you feel, but I mean in terms of welding people together. And I guess this is sort of one of the big, seeing as you brought it up, sort of the big hurdle of masculinity is it's both hypersexualized and like desexualized men
Yeah,
in a certain sense.
it's so odd that the porn generations of like millennials and Gen and Zoomers, they have the least sex of any generation.
Yep. Yep. No.
Because and I understand why, because all of their sexual energy is just depleted in front of a screen, essentially. Like
Yeah.
that's the be all and end all of it.
Yep. No, absolutely. And I guess sort of moving on now to kind of from sort of the sexual dynamic of or the sexual wasteland, let's say, of modernity and identity. Now let's sort of get on to kind of trying to revivify, traditional modes of being in a cultural sense, in a lived sense. So not necessarily political, but just sort of how you live your life and conduct yourself as a man. Now, me myself, fortunately, I had a pretty good role model with my dad. He was, he was a provider. He was there. He was involved, and I know that's not necessarily sort of your experience. So I got a lot of good insight into kind of how I wanted to live my life growing up from him. The danger, of course, or kind of the downside of that is the Christianity was always kind of like implicit in sort of what we were, and sort of what we believed and whatnot, but it was not explicit, and that was kind of one of the shortcomings. So I grew up not necessarily having a firm faith foundation, one that was sort of lived out by my parents, if that sort of makes sense. And then also the idea on the back end of what am I supposed to do to sort of attract a good woman and, start a family with her. That because that was always a goal of mine. It was kind of difficult because nobody, and I think this is something that the manosphere types, people like Red Hawk actually get right, is like no one really teaches you anymore sort of how to court and get the attention of a female and then sort of build on that sort of a life together and sort of get attraction, because I always had like pretty good game, let's say, in the sense that I was always able to attract females' attention, but it was just those early dynamics and sort of how you interact in a relationship with a woman, and sort of not being a doormat, not trying to just saying yes to everything and whatnot. Those were lessons I basically had to learn the hard way. So I guess passing it over to you, what were kind of the difficulties in sort of becoming a man outside of, again, like I said, sort of the identity and sexual aspect? So what were the hurdles for you in sort of trying to tap into religion and traditional masculinity today?
Yeah, like I've said before, like I grew up in a single parent household. My dad left way before I was even born. And that I mean that sounds hilariously like that sounds deadly serious to a lot of people, but that's so laughably northern that that's become a stereotype of northern people that we
Yeah,
don't know who our dad is.
the original Lizzo Americans, right? The
Yeah,
Lizzo
yeah.
English.
It's so tough, and it even then, I don't, it's tough to like say this without like it sound disparaging, but my mum wasn't a good role model for that either. She had like I'll just put it out there, like I've got five siblings, and all of us, all six of us, are from different fathers. So you can see where the like that doesn't necessarily set forth a good role model either.
No.
It's kind of odd, like because it came up spontaneously, and one of my friends always asks me like, when I met my wife, how did I know I wanted to marry her? Because I'll be honest, I was a virgin when I met my wife, and I married the first woman who took interest in me, and like it's tough because I honestly can only put it down to like spontaneity, and sometimes like God in the background as well. God guides you in ways that
Hmm.
you never see. But like
So,
I don't
so,
think I ever saw a relationship happening with a woman where it wasn't marriage material. Like
mm,
it's weird because you would have thought with my background that I would have been like a pump and dump kind of guy, but no, I was like it very much like, and it seems to be the same with all of my brothers, that we know what the opposite is, so we try not to
yeah,
recreate that. Like we know what it could be, so we don't do that.
right. I think there's two things that happen from those sorts of circumstances. The most common one, it seems to me, unfortunately, is people experience that and then they, recreate the experience they had as kids.
Definitely. Like I know so many young girls who have multiple children and they're single, and I'm just like you're only just reaching your early 20s and you've got two kids from two different guys,
Yeah.
neither of which have married you.
Yeah.
And it's such a common occurrence in the north. It's really sad.
No, it definitely is, and that's the sort of thing that also afflicts people up here as well. Um, but then, sort of a minority of people, and you'd think it would be more, but it is a minority, do sort of experience that, and they're like, "Yeah, I'm not going to repeat that mistake," basically. And it's, I think a lot of it kind of has to do with other factors. So for me, I was kind of a fairly serious evangelical as a kid. And again, having the example of my parents, I always wanted a family and I didn't, and I wanted to sort of like date with intent, right? Like, so that I had like a few girlfriends sort of before I met my wife, but the idea is that each one of them could potentially be marriage material. Now, of course, none of them ended up being that until, I met the missus or whatever. But what helped me, I think, was that faith, as imperfect as it was at the time. I was not some paragon of virtue, particularly in my college days or whatever in early 20s, but I was never an atheist, and I did have this Christian morality, which did sort of help me a bit. So even though I didn't have the benefit of understanding how to interact with women, and it didn't have sort of a deep sort of lived Christian experience, that really is kind of what ended up helping me make my life into something today, which I'm pretty content with. Was the religious underpinnings. Now, for you, what effect did Christianity have on sort of, I guess, setting your North Star, and how did it come about?
That's really odd because it's really odd for me because I'll admit that I during university, and like even before that when I was studying my A levels, and then a little bit afterwards, I was this like Soviet Union espousing anti-theist, and I have no idea what the heck my wife saw in me, because honestly she must have seen like the coal for the diamond, because when even when I met her, I was in a difficult position, and I wasn't even close to being like the masculine man that I am now, or even the Christian that I am now.
Mm. And did you meet
But
in
it,
China?
yeah, we met in China. We both taught in the same school, and like uh, her being and the way that our relationship formed definitely drove me to more towards Christianity. And just when you're so like when you're so against what the left and the I don't even like to call them the left these days, like the mainstream diatribe, when you're so against them, you look for things that are cohesive. And especially with me, one of my major was history, and history has always been my counterpoint for reference. And like, if people did things this way and it helped them propagate and live for thousands of years, maybe I should try that way. And that's why, in end, why I turned to Christianity, because I just thought, well, I'm gonna have a read of the Bible. I'm gonna look there and see what knowledge was passed down, and like as emblems of figures that you could imitate, there is no better book. I mean, there's also plenty of people that you shouldn't imitate in that book,
Yeah,
but they're there as an example, and
of
as has
course.
been
Yeah.
reiterated in this channel before. I mean, I always I've had experiences that I don't wish to imitate, and like yeah, Christianity became more of a bulwark against just the temptations of life, because as you try and become more traditionalist and you try and live a healthy and prosperous life, you see how perfidious and how all pervading the the current narrative is of just selfishness and and godlessness. It's just everywhere, and it's so hard to get around. And I mean, I lived in China, which is like peak godlessness.
Yeah.
When I think about like the reasons why I turned to faith, a lot of them were because of like the deracinated Chinese culture. I remember that in China, if somebody was hurt in an accident, people would not run and help that person because they were worried about being sued. And the fact that that was their first thought, it turned me instantly to like traditional Christian values, because you want to see why your own people do these things. And the reason why English people do this is because they're innately Christian, so they have some selflessness in them.
Hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I myself also majored in history at university, and I really do think that is something that did help me out quite a bit. Is that interest in history? So when because I was sort of I was fairly serious evangelical younger, and then I became marginal, but then I sort of became more serious again, and looking into history of Christianity and faith and the influence that it had sort of on the West in a good way, that ended up leading me into Orthodoxy. And at first, I was checking out these sort of other faith traditions, but then finding that, and then sort of the sacraments and having a religion that sort of demands things of you instead of just giving you things. So, of course, there are a lot of moral overlaps between evangelicalism and Orthodoxy, but Orthodoxy also has the sacraments. It has confession. It has the Eucharist, which you need to be prepared for. It's big on almsgiving and things like this. You're required to fast at certain times, and if you don't, you should probably confess those, and so on and so forth. So I think that really did sort of help temper my my outlook on what is actually the good life, because I knew a lot of these sort of things implicitly, through just common sense and history and sort of a generally conservative outlook growing up, sort of where I did. But the faith really has helped sort of crystallize a lot of things for me. And make the struggles that I dealt with in the past much easier to overcome. And I think that really is sort of the lone star, which I would recommend everybody follow. Is seek the Lord and ye shall find, basically.
Yeah, I was going to ask you on that note because, like, when I came to Catholicism, it was by like following the traditions of my own people. So I look back at like I said before, I look back at what the English did, and then I fell in with Anglicanism, and then I mean, Anglicanism is such a flipping joke that I then was like, okay, let's look for something. And I ended up in like Anglo Catholicism, which is kind of like a medium. Um, it's funny because um, I'm trying to remember his name. Um, John Henry Newman, Saint John Henry, Blessed John Henry Newman, as he is now in the Catholic Church, was a proponent of Anglo Catholicism, which is hilarious because he then ended up becoming a Catholic, which is funny because that's the ultimate line that I think that a lot of Anglo Catholics ended up coming to the conclusion of, was that why not just do Catholicism? Anyway, this is getting too far away from my original point. My original point was like, the reason I turned to Catholicism was because when looking back at the history of my people and the history of my identity, I ended up at Anglicanism and then Catholicism. Like, what got you into Orthodox? Because I would say that the Orthodox Church is a very ethnic church, and I say this because I know Bulgarians and Russians and Serbs who have their Orthodox churches, but like my friend who's Serb, he see like the Serb Orthodox Church is a very ethnic church. It's about Serbs and their way of following God. It's kind of like Anglicanism, but without the separatism. And the same with Greek Orthodox. It tends to be full of Greek. So, what got you into Orthodoxy as opposed to, say, I mean, Popery and Catholicism?
Yeah, that's a good question. So first was, from my perspective, sort of looking at the history of it, Orthodoxy just seemed to me to be more correct. It had a lot of the what you would say the benefits of Catholicism minus some of the theological or ecclesiastical issues I had. Um, it clearly had an apostolic tradition. And what initially got me into Orthodoxy, I think I might have mentioned this before on a stream in the past, but I had a friend in university who was an Orthodox, and he and his family were converts, and he was from a small town here in Alaska, and just sort of his living testimony of how he conducted himself in his life sort of made it interesting to me. And Alaska is a weird state in a lot of ways, but one way in which it is not like anywhere else in the country is it actually does have a pretty um, uh, long Orthodox history. So, of course, it was part of the Russian Empire for a long time. And the first saint, the patron saint of the of America, of North America, Saint Herman, was lived and was and died, and his remains and his monastery are still here in Alaska. And the amount of churches, although in terms of the size of each parish, they tend to be smaller. So there are definitely more Catholics in Alaska than Orthodox. But the number of churches of Orthodox and Catholic churches are actually at parity. So there's about just as many Orthodox churches as there are Catholic churches, which you'll find nowhere else in the
Mm,
United
I'm not,
States.
that's very surprising.
Yeah. So, and there's also a lot of Russian old believers in my town. So, you just see them and you're like, huh. So they're basically like the Orthodox Amish, essentially. And
Yeah.
so it wasn't quite so, and also it's much less of an ethnic religion up here. So the extent to which it is an ethnic religion are basically the Russian old believers and also um, some of the Alaska natives. A lot of them are Orthodox, but that's just because, I mean, their communities are very homogenous anyways. So it would make sense that that would be kind of their ethnic religion. But yeah, it's really lost a lot of the ethnic baggage in the United States, and I think that Orthodoxy in America is kind of going through a similar process that Catholicism did, where Catholicism was like the religions of, you know, the Polacks and the Italians and the Irish, you know, the
Hmm.
eternal Irish, and you know, they sort of did their thing, and it wasn't really for us. And but then over time, as Catholicism and those ethnic communities became less insular and more integrated, the church then sort of became much more in line with the national character, and I think that is happening with Orthodoxy in the United States, much more so than in Europe and in Alaska, especially because of that very long tradition Orthodoxy has up here,
Mm.
and most believers are actually converts or the sons or grandsons, granddaughters of converts. So, yeah.
I'm not leveraging that because it's a problem unique to Orthodoxy, because I honestly think that Catholicism has this problem as well. And I'm sick, absolutely sick to my back teeth of meeting ethnic Catholics. Just the people who say, like, well, I grew up Catholic or I went to Catholic school. It's become such a joke now because those people are not, they don't live a Catholic lifestyle. And
Yeah.
when you meet those people, they adhere so little to the traditions of our religion that they're a joke on the faith, essentially.
Yeah. One of the best signs that someone isn't Catholic is when they lead with, as someone who was raised Catholic, you know? That's,
Oh, definitely. I remember as part of my master's, I did a master's in the year from like 2021 to 2022. I mean, I don't think I could ever have done anything that was more like black pilling to set me more in tradition than going through the university system again. But the I met one of my teachers was a Brazilian, and she said to me, like, oh, how do you think people should be treated? And I said to her, I said, well, I'm a Catholic, and in Christ's teachings he teaches that we should all treat one another how we treat ourselves, and therefore we should treat each other the same. And she came out with that bloody line, which was like, well, I was raised Catholic, and I believe that people should I think people should do things as they want to be individually treated. And I was that was like that cemented me in my like ethnic Catholic belief. The people who are raised Catholic, I mean, there is a lot. I've got people who raise Catholic children, boomers who raise Catholic children have got a lot to answer for because they did so little to impart these values upon their children and their grandchildren.
yeah. I think this is an issue with not just Catholicism, but much of religion all over the world. You find this in certain Orthodox churches as well. Certainly in like mainline Protestant denominations. I mean, they're just hemorrhage. They're dying on the vine. Those
Hmm.
churches. And yeah, I think it's a generational thing. So kind of like a friend of mine, he blames like Americans and like Protestantism for like all the troubles of the world essentially, and he'll be like,
I
yeah,
don't
you know,
believe
but
that because, like,
and
you can berate Protestants as much as you want, but I mean, there's some traditions that Catholics have stolen from the Protestants.
yeah,
Like it,
like the pews,
they
yeah,
Yeah, and you can't blame them for everything. It's like, yeah, so what? But your ancestors were here in the face of them, and they capitulated.
yeah. And they'll talk about, people from South America, and they'll be like, oh yeah, they don't have all these American Protestant cultural sort of hangups and whatever about the religion and whatnot. But I mean, if you do look at Catholicism in South America or Central America, a lot of it is kind of, as you say, it's like ethnic Catholic. So they're very secular people in actuality. They haven't really been properly catechized. They don't know the faith that well.
Never
And they
forget as
just,
well that like the heart of the Democrat Party is dominated by ethnic Catholics, people who grew up in the faith, and
yeah,
they're total like, oh, up to term abortion is fine. Like
yeah,
these are the people we're dealing with.
yeah. No, and it's, so not to, again, I'm not trying to dunk on Catholics, but I think, the extent to which they have, Protestantism, so to speak, has problems. Catholicism, although maybe less extreme, certainly has these problems as well. And I think ignoring the sort of secularization of Catholic countries, traditionally Catholic countries like Italy or,
In France.
Mexico or France or whatever. I mean, you got to like face the music at some point. Like these, like these are
The
not
most
bastions of traditional
yeah,
Catholicism. This is
the
not
most
Pope Urban II
yeah,
Ville.
the most base church I've ever been in, hilariously, was in France. I went on holiday to France in August, and I was telling my wife we were looking for a mass for Sunday, and I just said like, well, I'm not going to understand any of the French, so let's go to a Latin mass. And the church that we went to was absolutely rammed to the heave, to all the everyone was like, there were so many people standing, all the pews were full, and I've never seen so many young white women with children, with that many children. Like, it was so
Nice.
unbelievably based. And it gave me some kind of hope. But equally, equally on the other hand, France has a lot of problems with, like, I would say, ethnic Catholics that are like, oh, I grew up in the faith, but I hold none of the principles. I just say I'm a Catholic, but I might as well not be.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's sad. And I think one of the things, this is my advice to everyone out there listening, find a church that has lots of young families, because if if they are there, that is usually a good sign that they are, they get it, right. And I'm fortunate to sort of be in such a church. I went there and I looked around. I'm like, dang, there's a lot of young kids here and a lot of young parents, and this is great. And you talk to the priest and you're like, he gets it. So
Yeah. On the
that's
other
good
hand,
advice.
if all the pews are filled with old people, you're in a dying church. Like,
Yeah.
um, one of the most emblematic churches I ever went to summarize that point was that when I was deep in my Anglo Catholic phase, I went to a church that was an Anglo Catholic one, and it was literally like less than less than 10 people, and all of them were old. It's like
Sad.
there's no future of this church. That this is where the church dies, is once all these people die.
Yeah. No, very sad. And I hate to see that sort of thing, but it
It's
you reap what
natural.
you
I think that's
sow,
the
right?
natural. Yeah, exactly. Like, if you didn't bother to drag your kids to this church and
Yeah.
impart on them these traditions, then you deserve it,
Yep.
honestly.
Yeah, and the clergy have to bear some responsibility as well. And unfortunately, there's a lot of liberal clergy, and more than that, just clergy who just assume that the people will get it, right. But they don't bother
Or
to
they're
teach,
too
and or they're too nice. They don't. There's no
they're,
like expectation of
they're too used to
participation.
to ethnic Catholic, they're too used to like the usual bunch filling their pews as well. They're like, "Oh, my pews
Yeah.
are full. I don't need to evangelize anyone. This is it. My pews will be full." And it's kind of like a day job for them. Like, well, I don't
Yeah.
really need to try that hard.
Yeah, it's sad, and even if they do have, sort of traditional Christian understandings about like theology or morals or whatever, it is like you say. Some of them, unfortunately, they treat it just like they clock in and they clock out. So,
Yeah.
and you do not,
Um,
you do
one
not
of the
want to be in that situation.
One of the surprising things for that Latin Mass in France as well was that even the priests were young. Like they were younger than me. And I'm not 30 yet. I'm close, but I'm not 30 yet. And they were younger than me. And it's so refreshing to see young clergy in a role. Because
Yeah,
I don't know about the Orthodox Church, but the Catholic Church is having a real hard time getting priests in. Which is their
yeah,
own bloody fault, to be honest. Like that has fully come to roost in their own choices and circumstances.
yeah. The clergy in the United States is, so I'm part of the Antiochian Archdiocese, and that is, I want to say 80% of the clergy are American converts. So a lot of them were like, Baptist ministers or, evangelical pastors or something. And then they
Hmm.
became Orthodox and then became deacons and then priests. So a lot of them are, you got a difference of age range. There's a lot of Gen X priests. There's boomers, of course, who are kind of the early adopters. Like a lot of people began to um, uh, American evangelicals began to convert to Orthodoxy, I believe, in the 80s. And my priest himself, I think, is in his late 30s, and he's got like 5 kids and his wife and whatever. And his dad, I think, was one of these early California converts to Orthodoxy. And so, yeah, I mean, in terms of priest age, like I've been to a couple of different churches up here, and yeah, one of them seemed like a Gen Xer, and the other one, like my priest, is like an old millennial. So, yeah,
Mm. It's
but
I think it's slightly different for Orthodox because obviously as an Orthodox priest you're allowed to get married and have children.
yeah,
Whereas with
and
a
if,
Catholic priest there's more levity because I mean you're not allowed to do that.
yeah, no, definitely, and of course, you certainly have a lot of old, gray beards in the Orthodox Church as well.
Yeah.
It's definitely not all young guys. I know the priest of one of the churches pretty nearby. He's a pretty elderly man, but yeah, just is what it is. So I'm just looking at the time here. I guess sort of in wrapping up on, again, we've talked about identity, we've talked about faith, we've talked about the dangers of coom, all these sorts of stuff. Now, I guess sort of to leave off, what would you say are the most important things that you've learned in sort of becoming a better man in the present world that you weren't aware of, but you sort of learned with time and you'd like to pass on to young Zoomer in the audience?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good one. The first one is for goodness sake go to the gym. Um I can't tell you how important that is for um just being a man. I mean, if you do a strenuous manual labor job and you don't overeat, then you'll get the same outcome as going to the gym. And I honestly see the gym as a bit modern and deracinated, but we have to live in the circumstances that we are. But get to the gym and lift. I said this in a tweet and it got so many likes, and I know that men know this, that if you're big and strong and tall, people take you seriously. And even if they don't take you seriously, they fear you, which I would say is them taking you seriously.
Yes.
Um, so get strong. It's so I mean, it sounds weird, but it is easy. It just takes a bit of commitment and drive, like maybe a bit of black coffee before you get to the gym, or some creatine, just to get you going. But go to the gym, lift, get strong. People will take you seriously, and you'll find it gets you further in life. My next point is sacrifice. As much as, like, I know a lot of our movement attracts pagans and whatever, but like we all, a central tenet of our faith and people who are in this movement is Christianity, and our emblematic, like the one person we should all look up to is Christ, and that's because of sacrifice. We need to sacrifice things. The reason why we rail on the coom so much and we rail on modern degeneracy is because they don't sacrifice. They do sacrifice, but not in the moment. They sacrifice later.
Yeah, it's a
Sacrifice,
Faustian bargain. It's the devil's sacrifice.
yeah. It's like, oh, I'll consume this Big Mac, or I'll watch this because it makes me feel good right now, and then in 30 years' time they're single and they're deracinated and they don't know where they wasted the years. Sacrifice. Get rid of the coom. Stop eating so much sugar. To channel some furious Pertinax, get those seed oils out of your life. Eat healthy fats. Don't go in for the thing that gives you instant satisfaction. Look for things where you can build up and it'll pay off later, because those things you'll never regret. Whereas every time you make a Faustian bargain, there'll be some regret there, and it builds up. And I think those are the two key points. I'm trying to think if I've got a third. Maybe I'll think of one after you, but I'll leave it to you. Those are my 2 points: lift and sacrifice.
Very good. Yes. Yeah, I have to agree on both of those points. Exercise is amazing, makes you feel good, gives you self confidence. Like you said, people do take you more seriously. You're more attractive to the opposite sex, which is of course good. There's literally no downside except for the time you put into it, and you don't even need to put in that much time. Like, I mean, if you're just starting out, I mean, if you just go like 5 days a week and just work out hard for like 30 minutes, I mean, you'll see results. You really will. Um, Sacrifice, yes. Um, if it's all about me and all about what I want and all about, just indulging and sloth and idleness and whatnot, and the coom and all that sort of stuff, I mean, that's no way to live. So you gotta sacrifice, absolutely. Now, and of course, we've also talked about the importance of faith. I don't think that needs to be reiterated here, but absolutely, get right with the Lord. I would, of course, advocate you go to an Orthodox church. Northern Man will advocate that you go to a Catholic church, but seek and ye shall find, I'll say. Now, other things, I would say definitely love your people and love your place. So what that means is love where you come from. Have a home, have somewhere that you can, somewhere you're willing to dig trenches in, sort of like my buddy Ernst von Sale says. You got to sort of be, identity has always historically been tied to the land and people. So I think when you come to love, and this is one thing I really hate to see, and you see it a lot in kind of the younger, far right Zoomers or whatever, is it almost seems like they hate where they come from and the people who live there. It's kind of a sort of a nihilistic impulse, and I think a lot of this is just youth. if you feel this way I mean, you shouldn't feel this way as a young person, but if you feel this way as like a married man with kids, there's something wrong with you. You gotta love where you come from. Like where I live, I'm a fourth generation Alaskan, and that means something to me. I love this land. I mean, I live here on purpose. I'm not up here just because of I'm chasing the buck in the city. Like I made a conscious choice to stay here because this is my home and I love it, and I like the people here. They of course have their problems, but they're my people. Essentially, they have ways of being, and they like certain things that I like. They enjoy the outdoors. They like guns, and they're at least somewhat culturally conservative compared to sort of the average. Not as much as I'd like to be, of course, but into such times and places we are called. The prophet Elijah, the Israelites were not exactly on the straight and narrow. Jonah, when he went to preach in Nineveh, he wasn't none too pleased about it, and he was kind of bummed when the fire and brimstone didn't come down. But hey, you gotta love where you come from, and you gotta love the people. And of course, Jonah didn't. He hated the Ninevites. That's a different story, but same point remains. So that would be one of my advice: love your people, love your place. Learn to talk to women. I think that's important. I think one of the problems that afflicts modern man more acutely than anything is sort of the alienation between the sexes. So the women folk are chasing the one percenters, like six figures and 6 feet tall, please, like this sort of thing. This is a problem, and men are alienated because of the coom and just being rightly, I think, dissatisfied with the quality of women these days. But if you go to the gym, if you present yourself as a serious man, if you have goals, and if you are guided by principles of the Christian faith, and if you learn how to talk with women, that automatically like makes you better than most guys out there by a long ways. And if you can harness these things and make yourself into somebody who is looked up to, by other people, by your colleagues, women will definitely notice that. And even if they're a little wayward and whatnot, that doesn't mean you should write off a chick just because she's not perfect. Now, obviously, avoid the obvious warning signs, right? If she's like a radical feminist, that's not for you. If she's an atheist, not for you. But if she is, Christian, even marginally Christian, but you are able to have leadership and dominion in your own life and are able to offer that to a woman, a lot of them will sort of see the wisdom in that, and they'll literally bend themselves, bend the knee in a certain sense, and want to become more like you because they actually admire you. And I don't mean that in a way to like boost your ego or whatever, but they admire a man who practices what he preaches. And success begets success, and true faith for those who seek it, I really do think is infectious, especially when the fruits are so self-evident. So that would be something I would say: talk to women, love your people, love your place, find what you can do. So this kind of goes back to the sacrifice, but so much of politics are in our circle is all tied up with with like national stuff, and just the intricacies of politics and elite theory and blah blah blah. And all this is important, and I'm not saying it's not interesting. I consume this content just as much as anybody else. But how can you make where you live a nicer place to raise a family, and somewhere that you're proud to call home, and leave a better place than than what you found it. So I would say that's important, and it can be political. It could be social organizations. It could be getting involved in your church. It could be volunteering. It can be helping out kids or whatever. But find something that you can do which benefits other people and not just yourself. So that would be my advice. And yeah, LARP it until you make it.
I did actually finally think of one, like I said, I would when you'd finished. And that is, as the great philosopher Dominic Toretto once said, nothing is stronger than family. And
Amen.
pursue that, for goodness sake. Like, you're going to find the ties that bind you the strongest are the ones that are bound in blood. If that, of course, as difficult as it is, you're not going to be able to evangelize your family sometimes, and you'll find that they don't always meet the standards you expect. But when you're in a bind and you need help, they will provide the help you need, and equally do the same for them. Sacrifice for your family. It links back into what I said before: sacrifice for your family, and make sure those bonds are strong, because at the end of the day, you only have one family that God gives you. You need
Yep.
to like grow it as much as you can.
Absolutely. And tangentially connected to that, I would definitely advocate that people get good in real life male friends.
Well, that I was going
Because
to counterance one of the things you said about like it's all good talking to women when when you don't have a woman, but female friends when you've got a woman are not a good idea. I would
yeah,
always say, as a young man, don't look. Try and find males a similar age to you with similar outlooks, even if their politics are a bit rough, they're a bit gay, they're a bit lame. Like, you can work on that, but like,
yeah,
at least with young fit men, you'll have some similar interests.
no, absolutely. And male friendship is so important. And it's one of the things that is really, I think, undervalued today. And one of the reasons why a lot of young men just kind of feel lost. So, Mr. Young Zoomer out there, go find like good male friends to be buddies with. And they don't even have to be like your certain age. Like a lot of my best friends are, like Gen X dudes. And
Hmm.
they were my friend. They became my friends because in a lot of ways they were people I wanted to emulate and people whose values were similar to mine. And we like to do things together. We like to Brian hang out and whatnot. And same thing here. When I moved back to Alaska, I plugged in and I'm like, all right, I need. And a lot of them had sort of moved away at this point, but some of them were still there, and I was making new ones. I'm like, yeah, I need to have like bros. That's
I,
actually important because it
I'll
does
agree.
it gets you invested in your area, and then all of a sudden you're friends with guys who have their lives together, who have kids, who have a stake in the community, and now you can do things to make that place better. And not only that, but it gives your wife sort of a more extended network that they can tap into, gives your kids friends to play with. And it's also just very nice for, you know, just building real camaraderie and expanding the safety net, right? Beyond just the immediate family. And hopefully you don't ever need that. But, it's just nice to have real friends that you can rely on. And a lot of young men really don't even have that, which is it's kind of baffling to me. But I mean the numbers don't lie. It's just a lot of people just really don't. They're just very isolated, very deracinated, very atomized, and this is not a healthy way to live. So absolutely 100% recommend get real in real life, male friends.
Yeah, I agree because I have been in the opposite situation. Like where I studied my masters, I tried to make friends and I tried to branch out and find new people to like cooperate with, and it was tough and I ended up isolated, and it kind of just makes you hate not just the people but the place. And
Oh yeah,
you don't want to be like that. It flies in the face of like traditions of faith, but not only that, traditions of people.
yeah,
Um, and there's always a community to tap into, like especially if you go down the Christian route, there'll always be a like an area where you can make friends. No matter what church I've been to, there's always been a young group that you can tap into, or even older friends. I mean, sometimes you want older friends because they have wisdom that you don't. They have
absolutely.
experiences that you can tap into and gain experience from.
Absolutely. Absolutely. 100%. Well, I guess that would be it. Anything you'd like to share before we end, Northern Man? This has been an awesome conversation.
Yeah, I'm hoping to put out a video soon. Please go to the channel, like and subscribe. If you really want like unadulterated garbage that I post, then hit up my Twitter channel. I'm always posting on there. Usually not just posts, but trolling other people in our community by dropping a comment on. Um, but yeah, my Twitter channel, my YouTube channel, please go and have a look at them. And I will try and post a video in the next week or so about like an English identity and what I think Anglo-Saxon people can do in the current moment.
Excellent. Very good. And um, I'll be sure to add links to those in the video description later so you guys can check in on them later today or tomorrow, and they should be there. Um, Again, thank you for everyone watching. If you're new to the channel, please give it a like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube garbage shilling. If you want to support the channel, shoot me a message or whatever on Subscribestar. Make requests even. You're absolutely invited to do that as well. Every little bit helps, and especially with the family and whatnot. So more mouths to feed, more problems, but it's a joyful burden. Aside from that, yes, like a reminder, next weekend I'll be having Jimmy Thomas on to discuss modern warfare, the war in Ukraine, and also I'll be creating another video in my reflections this week, reflections of Russian statesmen, that is, and I'm going to think about trying to make some more video essays as well. So I know that's kind of an obsolete format, and I know it takes more time, and they get only as they get about as many views as a stream does, but for way more effort and time input. So the incentives are kind of misaligned, but I don't know. I feel like I should make some more video essays. So, anyways, thank you very much, guys. Go to church tomorrow. God bless. Anything you're going to say, Northern Man?
I was going to say, thank you very much for having me on. I appreciate it. Congrats with the 4K subscribers. It's
Oh,
a
thank
good
you.
effort. And I mean, I'm open. I'm always available if you want to do things like more regularly, talk about things, even like philosophize for a bit. It doesn't have to be as long as this, but I've really enjoyed it. So thank you very much for having me on.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for coming on, Northern Man. And for everyone out there, have a good night. I'll talk to you next time. Patriarch.